second point in the chapter dealing with the social question. As we saw the social importance of the urban working class rising, mostly during the second part of the 19th century, a logical consequence of this was that on the political field, the labor movement also grew. By labor movement, we can call all the associations of workers that tried to defend the interest of the working class, either at the level of the companies, and at that level we call the association of workers trade unions, or on the strictly political field, and here we can speak about political parties. A political party being also an association, but aiming to promote some ideas and influence power or even access to power. So the labor movement is a vast political movement that emerged in most industrialized countries at the end of the 19th century in an economic context that was a context of economic slowdown. In fact, we call that period that stretches from the 1870s to the almost the end of the 19th century, the Great Depression or Long Depression sometimes. It put an end to the period of expansion and prosperity that had occurred during the French Second Empire, for example. The consequence of that is that with this stop in the rise of the living conditions of the people, the question of poverty and bad living conditions of the working class became a political issue again at the end of the 19th century. I will make a difference between France and Britain. In France, the labor movement was characterized by the fact that it was particularly radical, but also very divided. In the period from 1890 to the First World War, there was an increasing number of strikes in France, and not only in France. A strike is an action by workers who decide to stop working in order to put pressure on their employer or on the government and obtain something. This growth of strikes was part of an international movement of workers, actually. An important date of this international labor movement was May 1886, when workers in Chicago protested in order to demand what had become, in fact, the international demand of the working class, the 8-hour workday. On that day in Chicago in 1886, some workers that were demonstrating were killed by the police. And after that, it was decided in an organization called the International Workers' Organization to celebrate the workers every 1st of May, what is called May Day ever since. And it happened all over the world, and in France it happened in particular in May 1891. And on that day, in the small city of Fourmi, in the very north of France, a city of miners and iron and steel industry, 9 people were killed while they were marching on the 1st of May, because the industrialists in this city did not want the people to get on strike on that day, and they asked the police and the army shot against them. It was maybe one of the starting points, really starting points of the labor movement in France, because the echo of that massacre was really huge. A couple of years later, a second tragic event also gave another boost to the French labor movement. It is known as the Courrières mine disaster. In March 1906 in Courrières, an explosion took place inside a mine, and more than 1,000 miners died because of this coal dust explosion. The workers immediately went on strike in order to protest against their very difficult working conditions and the danger of their work. And this strike was cracked down in blood. The Président du Conseil of France at that moment was Georges Clemenceau. This crackdown led to numerous strikes all over the country. Throughout the spring of March 1906, you can see pictures of these strikes in Lens on the left and also here in Grenoble on the right. I think we can say that it was the first time and the last time maybe that in France a revolution of the working class was seen as possible, and there was hope in the labor movement and there was fear for the government at that moment. This general strike did not end up in a revolution. It was a failure. Maybe one of the reasons why it was a failure was that the trade union movement in France was rather weak. So again, a trade union, we call that syndicat in French, is an association of workers that organize themselves in order to defend their interests and their rights. In 1905 in France, many trade unions decided to create a confederation in order to be stronger. That was called la Confédération Générale du Travail, or CGT. It was created in Limoges in 1905, and one of its most famous demand, like many trade unions in the world, was the 8-hour day of work. But I said the labor movement in France and the trade union movement was rather weak. We can see that if we compare some numbers. By 1905 in France, approximately 670,000 workers were unionized. They had the right to join a union since 1884. But in the UK, there were already 3.4 million workers who had joined a union. They had this right since 1871. Just for comparison, in Germany, there were 2.6. So you see, France was really the less advanced of the European industrial countries regarding unionization of the workers. In fact, many strikes were cracked down in blood, even by left-wing governments in France. I think the reason for that is that there was a strong opposition to labor movement, not only by the bourgeoisie, that was rather normal, but also by all the non-salaried people that were still very numerous in France. The farmers, the shopkeepers, the artisans, they did not feel in solidarity with the workers of the factories and the mines. Okay. Moreover, nationalism was very important in France at that moment, in particular in the context of high tension with Germany. So for many people, the people that went on strikes, the people that joined the union, they were not loyal enough to France in its rise to power in order to fight against Germany again. Moreover, the labor movement in France was very divided. On the most extreme radical side, so the far left, really the far left, you had most trade unions like the CGT, who were very revolutionary, who believed that they did not trust the Republic, in fact. They did not believe the Republic could give them what they wanted. And so they were mostly in favor of a revolution. Just like what Karl Marx had said at the middle of the 19th century. And one socialist politician of France really embodied this very revolutionary form of socialism is Juliet. He was the leader of the Marxist party, so advocating the destruction of capitalism by a revolution that was very successful in some cities but had only 5% of vote at the national scale. These people were very radical. They did not trust the Republic. But other socialists in France believed that it was possible to make some reforms in favor of the working class within the Republic, and maybe the revolution would come later. The symbol of this other movement in the socialist movement was Jean Jaurès. He founded the first United Socialist Party in France in 1905, called the SFIO, Section Française de l'Internationale Ouvrière, and is a good symbol of these socialists that were also Democrats and sincere Republicans. If you look at this division, you can see what will remain a very important division of the French left all over the years. A division between those who really believe only revolution will be the good solution, and those who believe that you can reform progressively things in order to improve the life of the workers. That's a very important pattern. In those days, the socialists really represented the far left in France. You must understand that. The dominant political party of the beginning of the 20th century was the Radical Party, but contrary to what the name suggests, it was more a party of the center-left, mostly united around the idea of the defense of the Republic against the right-wing Catholics, but really opposed to socialism. The electors of the Radical Party were mostly the artisans, the farmers, the shopkeepers, in other words, the non-salaried people. And even if some radical governments were supported by socialist deputies, the socialists almost never took part in governments. In Britain, the growth of the labor movement was rather different, and we can see that the characteristics of the British labor movement was to be less revolutionary, but in fact consisting in a wider wave, and so maybe a stronger political influence. In the UK, like in Germany, industrialization had been fast, and so it had led to the fast emergence of an urban working class that could express its identity politically through the vote. I mean, once they got the right to vote. The consequence of this was a better unity of the labor movement. The social question became extremely important at the end of the 19th century because debates about the conditions of the poor were really dominant. We could quote the novels of Charles Dickens, who made this issue very, very famous in Britain, but also some sociological investigations, like the one made by this man called Charles Booth, who published an inquiry about the working people in London. It was called Life and Labour of the People of London. And Charles Booth mapped different levels of poverty, from poverty to wealth in every street of London. And so it was a very, very specific inquiry. His conclusion was that 1/3 of the London population lived in poverty, and that half of the very poor people were not unemployed, but they were paid wages too low to sustain their life. So he was a strong advocate of government action in order to help the poor. He notably believed that pensions should be given to the old people. And because there was this growing quantity of information that was popularized by newspapers, and the fact that newspapers were read by an increasingly educated population, these ideas, these facts were some pressure for change. The working class had grown very widely, and geographically speaking, the working class were concentrated in some specific districts, mostly in the inner cities, as middle-class people tended to migrate to the suburbs. The consequence of this on the political level was very interesting. We will see that a bit later. But first of all, I would like to do a very quick summary of the building of left-wing parties, so parties of the labor movement on the political field. They were more or less all created at the same moment. You had a Marxist party that advocated revolution, which was called the Social Democratic Federation. A more reformist, so not revolutionary party, was the Fabian Society, who advocated greater state action for the poor, but no revolution. And more or less the same stance was taken by the Independent Labour Party, created in 1893. But the rise of trade unionism was also important. We saw previously how numerous were the unionized workers. The trade unions of Britain had got together in an organization called the Trade Union Congress that still exists today, the TUC. It was created in 1868, and it coordinated all the trade unions in Britain. So politically, no labor people had been elected at the beginning of the 20th century yet. But one event of the very beginning of the 20th century changed everything. It was a strike that happened among railwaymen in Wales. They worked for a company called the Taff Vale Railway, and they went on strike in 1900 in order to protest against the fact that one of the workers had been fired. The strike was very important, but the direction of the company decided to employ workers from the outside when the workers of the Taff Vale Railway Company were on strike. You can call in English those workers from the outside that are seen as traitors by the people who are on strike as blackleg. Okay, that's a nickname for them. And for this reason, the workers on strike decided to do some sabotage, and they damaged some of the railways, and they obtained negotiations with the company over their wages. So they got what they wanted. But the company decided to sue them. That is to say, the company called for justice and wanted the trade union to pay for all the money that had been lost during the strike. And the tribunal said, okay, it is known as the Taff Vale case, or Taff Vale ruling, and it was a terrible new law, because if the trade unions had to pay for the money that had been lost during a strike, well, it purely and simply meant that strikes would not be impossible. So this event is considered very important because it made the trade unions understand that they needed to transform politics and to make laws in order to protect themselves. And this event led to the creation of the Labour Party the same year, under the leadership of Keir Hardie. And what is very, very important if you want to understand the Labour Party in Britain is to understand that it was a union of all the left-wing parties that I have presented a few minutes ago, and the trade unions in Britain. The trade unions support the Labour Party. The link between the party and the trade unions is very, very strong. It is exactly what is largely absent from the French left wing. So the Labour Party from 1900 was the dominant party of the working class, and the trade union movement was very, very strong. So the consequence of this was that at the 1906 general election, the Labour Party managed to gain 29 seats in Parliament, 29 MPs. I said a few minutes ago that an important fact was that the British working class was really living the same areas in the inner cities. And so because they were very concentrated in some places, if these places were constituencies, these constituencies voted in majority for Labour. This is why some Labour MPs were elected as soon as 1906. Okay? The consequence of this election of Labour was that in alliance with the Liberals, in 1906 they passed an act called the Trade Dispute Act that destroyed the Taft Vale ruling. And so this law now protected the trade unions. They could not be sued for the damages incurred during a strike. That was a very, very important law for the Labour movement in Britain. And what we can see on the second cartoon here is that this trade dispute bill was passed by the Liberal Party. You can see it represented in the foreground. But really thanks to the pressure put by the rising of the Labour Party. Okay? And so on the eve of World War I, the number of strikes increased a lot, and the trade unionism was really growing fast in Britain because more than 3 million workers were unionized. And so you have this characteristic of the greater unity of the labor movement in Britain than in France.